Praise the Lord, guys. I'm Shaw Greenhorn. And he said unto him, 100 measures of oil. So he said unto him, take that bill, sit down quickly, and write 50. So he said unto another, how much owest thou unto my lord? And he said, 100 measures of wheat. He said, take that bill, sit down quickly, and write fourscore. Now the lord of this unjust steward commended him because he had done wisely. For the children of this world are in their generation wiser than the children of light. Therefore I say unto you, make unto yourselves friends of the unrighteous mammon, that when you fail they may receive you into everlasting habitations. For he that is faithful in that which is least is also faithful in that which is much. And he that is unjust in that which is least is also unjust in that which is much. So here we have, in the 16th chapter of Luke, still at the beginning, this, parable of this, wasteful steward, right? We understand that the 15th chapter ended off with the prodigal son, who was a son that was wasteful with his father's goods. So now we're seeing it from the viewpoint of a servant that is not this man's son. And, we're already expecting to see such a striking difference in how, the son, he was forgiven because he had that unconditional love of being this man's son. But now with this steward, right, we see, we know the story how this will go, how his fate will turn out. So, no, I guess we can understand and appreciate a difference in the story how the prodigal son, he asked for an inheritance and he left and he wasted it. But, with this story, he was actually over this man's goods, right? So, whereas the prodigal son, his, loss was counted for and calculated, right? And the father, he knew that he could suffer loss of this thing. The difference with this servant, right, is that he's there operating and being, wasteful and nobody knows. It was only, even though it doesn't say in detail, after he had made such, a waste that it became a huge issue. So I guess you can say that, for the prodigal son, the impact was less, right? The father, he knew beforehand what he was getting into. But with this, steward, this unjust steward, as he's called now, is, he's operating in the dark, right? And we know that darkness is the absence of light, which is knowledge. We know the kingdom of darkness is what, the devil, he runs. And, if you understand how the devil works, right? He does what he does, but he does not, like to be known. When people see these things happening, they say, well, it's just, the turn of life. If there's a movie with Michael J. White and, Steven Seagal, where Michael J. White said unto him, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. So, going with that, seeing that we can't see these things. When these things happen, people accept them as normal, right? So this steward, it would appear that everything is going on because this, Lord, he did not expect his steward to be wasteful like this with his goods. Never in a million years he imagined this would happen. He promoted him because he saw something in him. I spoke in the last video about how people, they will present themselves one way and then over time, then they'll deteriorate into who they really are. I use an example of a job interview, or people show up so, diligent and professional and courteous, but then, you hire them and give them a few weeks or months, and, you see the monster that lies within, right? We saw this story, it started out how this man had a steward and it was accused of him that he was wasteful with this man's goods. And how he called him unto him and said, how is it that I hear this? And give an account of that stewardship, thou mayest no longer be steward. Then the steward started to say within himself, what shall I do? Because my Lord is about to take the stewardship away from me. To dig I cannot, and to beg I am ashamed. I am resolved on what I shall do when I'm removed from the stewardship, that they might receive me into their houses. So we saw him, calling unto him each one of his Lord's debtors. And he asked the first one, how much owest thou unto my Lord? And that's where this answer comes from. It is the answer to that question that this steward, this unjust steward asked this Lord's debtor. So, understanding that, this man, he's running a business, right? He is our Lord. And how does he pay his workers? It's with the money that he makes from this business, right? So, I mean, how unfair is it that this steward, he's giving away his Lord's goods, being wasteful with them, right? But then, at the end of the week, he's gonna expect his paycheck, right? Depending on if they get paid monthly or weekly or whatever, or by assignment. I mean, it's a double dealing, double standard for you to waste the very thing that I'm using to pay you. But then let the time come and I'm unable to pay you, and see how angry you get. So can you understand, how I would feel about my goods? And like I said, he was operating, unknown, undetected, unseen, right? Doing these things. That just goes to show you that things, they can be, running a wreck, a complete wreck, but on the surface everything looks good. There's many internal diseases that, by the time they reach to the skin, I mean, it's so bad, it's almost, you can't recover from it. But yet still, everything would have seemed, so okay at a moment's glance. So, it's really amazing me right now how this steward, he was, there doing all these things, these reckless things, right? even though the Bible doesn't go into specific details of what he did, but we understand that he was being reckless. And, everything seemed right. Everything seemed okay, until, however, this Lord discovered, I made stipulations in the last video. Did one, of the other servants hear him talking or overhear something and then come and tell the Lord? Somebody catch it in the books, in the accounting. Was this man out, bragging? Was it one of the business partners that came and brought this to the Lord's attention? Maybe he was really good friends with him, even though he was, getting these things at such a reckless rate that he had the integrity within himself enough to come and tell this Lord, right? So, we see him about to answer this question because he's calling unto them, this man, his debtors, right? People that owe him money, about to. And in his mind right now, he's setting it up because he's about to lose this thing because he knows what he's been doing. And, the Lord knows, if he was innocent, he wouldn't be doing this, right? If he was innocent, then, he could hold his position. He could defend himself. And this, if being innocent, he wouldn't have the heart to think because this is very malicious what he's about to do. I mean, this is a business and these men, they owe these things, right? I'm sure that this Lord, he couldn't go and do this to these men. This servant is about to give all these discounts, right? So he called unto them, this man's debtors, who he should have been, in contact with, receiving this man's money. What was he doing? Not only is he wasting things, he's not even taking payment for what he's giving out, right? The levels of neglect and negligence of this steward is just, rising moment by moment as we, unfold this story. So he called unto him, the first one said, how much owest thou unto my Lord? And he said, 100 measures of oil. And he said, take thy bill, sit down quickly and write 50. So, we understand that, oil and wheat is the two things that, we're dealing with. So in those days, like I said, and always will say, the main thing, people, they planted crops and they grew animals. So we see this man, with his wheat. He's a wheat harvester. And he also does oil, I think the most famous oil in those days would have been like maybe olive oil, right? We know that the woman had the alabaster box of ointment that, anointed Jesus. So we see a culinary, approach to this man's, empire. So he calls on to this man, this first one, and he owes him 100 measures of oil, to compare the oil to the wheat. As we're about to see, he gave a 50% discount on the oil and a 20% discount on the wheat when we get there. So now that's almost, 3 times. Of course, 20 to 50, that's 2.5, right? And, I looked up the price per pound of oil, versus wheat is 71 cents, currently today for a pound of oil versus 11 cents for a pound of wheat, which is a 6.5 time, more value. So we see a 6.5 more value and almost a 3, times in the discount given. So he comes onto this man, how much owest thou unto my Lord? And he said, 100 measures of oil. So, I really don't have a frame of reference for how much this is. But this steward, he's about to give this man a 50% discount. Now, if you ask this Lord, is he giving discounts? He'll probably tell you no, right? Because you know how these men are, how good they are at haggling and bargaining prices. And if he was negotiating with people, he wouldn't, go for a 50% discount. And no doubt, when they were making this deal, there was an agreement made. The price was already haggled, right? We already, gave our hardest face, the fake walking away and then had the person call you back, threatening to leave, threatening to go elsewhere. These men, they had both strutted their stuff and both of them, they fought for a position that would, the best thing that they could get. And, how hard it was to get to this agreement. I can imagine, exchange of words, tempers might have even flared a little bit. Everyone, stepping around to make sure, people know that they're not to be, messed with or toyed with or played with, making a statement. Do you know who I am? Do you know who I am, right? How these men, they arm wrestled each other. It was at a standstill, right? Who's gonna win? And everything worked out to the strength of each of these men's ability in service that they provide. And they're the worth of their business. So he tells him, sit down and write 50. So was this the same kind of thing that this steward was doing, right? Was it the same kind of thing that got this attention that he was, maybe, or even was he getting full price and then applying this discount and then pocketing the rest? The nature of his wastefulness is not made, and it would have been so great because we could dive further into what was going on, the mindset, the frame of mind that led him to this thing. We could deconstruct how to identify these things. I could give you, real life examples, and I could, just, pick it apart completely so that you have all the pieces, but, it's not given, and I wish it was. So, take that bill, sit down quickly and write 50. So, take that bill, right? That means the bill of sale. So then, is he now saying that he only received 50, right? Take that bill, sit down and write 50, right? Or is he, applying the discount, saying that, well, we did get 100, but we're getting a discount to pay for only 50. It sounds like the first one, right? That he's saying that, well, we only got 50, so we're only going to pay for 50. This Lord, he's giving away his goods like this, right? This servant, he's being so reckless right now. I can't help but keep saying it. If you will just ask this Lord, are you giving discounts right now? He's going to tell you no. And it goes to show you that, the approach that a person can have in life. Because, this Lord, being a businessman, maybe traveling the world as far as he could go, right? In those days, making deals, signing contracts, getting orders filled for people, supplying them, knowing the value and the worth of things, right? We can see that this story, he does not know the worth of things. And you see, when you don't know the value of something, you're more likely to mistreat it and abuse it. Some lessons are learned, only through hardship. This man, when he was starting out, this Lord, no doubt he's maybe started from somewhere small, and he had to work so hard, right? He had to carry himself in such a way that he had to overcome a lot of things. He had to fight his way to the top. He knows the value of these things. He knows that when he was starting out, people wouldn't do the same for him. That he couldn't play with nobody else's goods. And then, whatever he owed, he had to be on point, with that thing. He had to be so accountable. And, he couldn't try and pull nothing on anybody. And now you're telling me that after all of that, all these people, they come and do this to me. So take that bill, sit down quickly, and the sit down quickly part, sit down quickly so nobody sees you doing it. Sit down quickly so I can just, slide it in with the other papers. Nobody sees it. Don't draw too much attention. Sit down quickly, right? Things done quickly like this, it's dishonest, right? And, the ethics of this man to know that, well, he got 100, but this servant is charging him 50, right? If he has the ethics to go through with this, then he is not as operating in the full character of what is available to him. And sometimes in life, we think that we get away with these things, right? We think that there's no cost to us. We think that we can shortchange, and in the moment we win. But life has a way of settling debts, right? Life has a way of getting back, even in the score. You go and you do this to this man, and these things, they never come in a way that we would like them to come. They usually come in a way that's very sour, right? It comes in a, there's a proverb in the Bible that the father have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge, showing how the consequences of the previous generation, how it permeates, down to, generations down. So, if this man is, willing to take this deal, then that's a loss for him in character and strength. And these things, they do matter, right? And they do count. I think that at the end of the day, to stand, in full strength of integrity and character, right? And purpose is worth more than anything you can gain in, like these things in the short-term gain. It's worth so much more. So take that bill, sit down quickly and write 50% discount. So he's telling him to write these things. And, if we backtrack a little bit, he just said, so that when I am put out of the stewardship, they might receive me into their households. No, this servant, he's being so short-sighted, right? Because if you're taking this man's oil and you gave, 100, measures of oil, and now he's only paying for 50, who you think is going to be crazy enough to invite you anywhere near any of their goods? You missed the lesson that you're teaching this person about you. This steward, he was given this position. The Lord must have seen something in him, some wisdom, some experience and maturity. He had to see something promising. But if we deconstruct his choices and behavior, we see that I already said that he doesn't know the value of things. He doesn't even know that how he presents himself to others. They're going to remember that, and what he's doing right now, giving a 50% discount on this oil. So the next verse says, so then he called unto him another of the Lord's debtors and said, how much owest thou? And he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said, take that bill, sit down quickly, and write 80. So same thing, take that bill, sit down quickly. Take it and cross out, that you've had 100 and just write 80 and pay me for 80. Because now what he's about to do, he's about to try and get this money and put it, and so that the loss doesn't look as great. Right? He's trying to, barter. And he's trying to paint as pretty a picture as he can. because this lord, he could have been put in jail for this thing if he's unable to pay. Having been sold even is what the custom was in those days. You were sold to pay for either your theft or your debt. We know that the story about that lady. She lost her husband, and he had some debts, right? And they were coming to take her sons, and the prophet told her to get as many vessels, and had her fill them with oil. She filled everyone until there was nothing left, so that she could pay. And he told her, pay the sell that and pay the debt, and then live off the rest. It was so much. They were going to come in to take her sons. So in those days, they would sell people to have the debt be paid, right? So he's trying to paint as pretty a picture about the circumstances, falsely, right? So now we see him giving a 20%, because he said, right, four score, which is 80. So comparing both these things, a 50% discount on the oil versus only a 20% discount on the wheat, right? And why? What's the motivation behind something like this? Because remember, the oil is way more expensive, right? So you know he's gonna owe way much more for the 100 measures of oil than for the 100 measures of wheat. The wheat is so cheap anyways. Giving a 20% discount is already so cheap, right? It's not a big deal, but the oil is more expensive. So that's why he, in order to get him to pay right then and there, he gave a bigger discount on the oil. Like I said, I looked up the prices per pound. Oil was 71 cents and the wheat was 11 cents. Today, in what are we in, July 2026, that's a six and a half times more value, where he gave 20% versus a 50%, which is two and a half. So you have a six and a half times more value and a two and a half more times more discount. So you come on to the second one. Now, were they in view of each other? What was the time frame in which he did this, right? Did he have them all in the same room? Did he call one after the other? Did they see each other? Did they get to speak to each other, right? Did was this a public thing among them that this servant is doing this thing? Like I said, his intention right now is that when he's put out of the stewardship, they might receive him into their houses. We see this man having the mindset of a freeloader, and worst kind of freeloader, a wasteful freeloader. Because now he wants to be received into their house so he can go and continue freeloading. I spoke in the last video how he has the wrong mindset. If he had been steward over all these things, then he should know how this thing runs. So that he should see how easy it is, to run this thing, and even to start his own kind of heart he should have been having right now. So it shows how we can all be in the same environment but still have such different approaches, different beliefs. We can all be standing right next to each other, and one he has the heart of a fighter, right, and a conqueror. But the next one, he has the heart of a baby, looking for who's gonna breastfeed him. We have one that's willing to conquer nations, and we have a next one that's looking to be breastfed, and they can be standing right next to each other. We know that all men are created equal, and it would appear, by a casual glance, that they are indeed equal. But if you were to sit down and consider, you would see that they are not all equal. So what separates these two kinds of men, right? It's intention, right? It's trying, right? It's trying and failing and getting back up again. It's starting where you are and growing over time. No, hardly any man starts at the top, conquering these things. He first conquers himself. He learns life's lessons. He overcomes his setbacks and hardships. He doesn't quit. He doesn't have a heart to take from others like that. He would rather give than to take, because if you get used to taking, then you expect from others, and then you sit around and wait, and it never comes. The man that's the giver, right? He understands that in order to give, he has to have to give. So then he goes and he gets this thing. There's so many different psychological processes happening in these two kind of people. The conqueror, he has such a weight of self-respect. If you were to come and try to baby him, he would be so upset. While the other would love the babying, because this means that no, you're gonna feed him and breastfeed him, like I'm saying, right? But the conqueror, if he would ever even seem that you're approaching his authority, he would be so willing to defend it. Because what this breastfeeding person doesn't understand is that when people give unto you, then they assume authority over you, they assume control over you, they assume dominance over you. And then you're gonna understand, well, what does these things mean? Well, it means that, well, you can't give your own answer, they speak for you. Then you're gonna say, okay, what does that mean? Well, it's gonna mean that they're gonna hold you in a box, and they're gonna expect you to stay in that box. Well, then you're gonna say, well, what does that mean? That means you're gonna be restricted from moving anywhere. How are you gonna grow and spread if they have you in a tight corner and you have to do everything that they tell you. You think they're gonna, encourage you to be better than them. These things, they're lost in modern society. I always, laugh to myself. We used to hunt saber-toothed tigers, and wild boars. We used to fight lions and those kind of things, right? And now people complain so hard if you mess up their Starbucks, latte order. Or so the next verse says, so the Lord of this servant commended him because he had done wisely. For the children of this world are in their generation wiser than the children of light. So now we see unusual response from this Lord. I was thinking that he would have gone the other way, that he would have been upset. You're giving away these discounts. Did he know of these great discounts, the 50% on the oil? Did he know of these kind of numbers that was going on? Or was it such a case that these men, they didn't ever pay their bill? So to get it from them, the Lord, he was so happy. Was that the case? Much more detail is not given about, this man's, business relationship with these, debtors. So he commended him because he had done wisely. So, and if we look at this, like I said, why would he think that this was wise? If you look at it, then I guess if he has a farm and he's growing these things, right, then it's just the cost of the seed, right, which is next to nothing. I mean, maybe selling like maybe 5 measures of this, oil, even to one person, gave back, more than he paid for all the seed to harvest to get this oil. And maybe that was the case because he was, minding these, he was, reaping, sowing and reaping these things. If you take in the cost of the seed, and maybe, maybe even selling one, would equal the entire cost, right? Why would he say that this is wise? Like I said, maybe these were men that did not pay their bill, and the fact that he wasn't able to get anything from them, which will show you that, sometimes the bar in life can be dropped so low that you rejoice over things that you should be upset over. Sometimes the bar in life can be dropped so low that you rejoice over things that you should be upset over. Because I'm looking at this thing and I'm upset and it's not my things. And he's, commending him that he is, wise because he had done wisely. Now we know that, looking at this story, he's anything but wise, right? Being wasteful with the goods, giving discounts. Now, looking to go, sponge off somebody else when I am put out of this stewardship that they might receive me into their houses. I don't see any wisdom in this story. There's none. I can only say that the bar was dropped so low that this Lord was rejoicing over things he should be upset over. There's a story about the frog that if you put him in a frying pan and you turn the fire up so low and increase the temperature really slow, that he'll stay there and be cooked in this pot. Because, with each, small change in temperature, he said, oh, it's not a big deal. Oh, it's not a big deal. Oh, it's not a big deal. And he stays there. Oh, it's not a big deal. Oh, it's not a big change. It's not a big change until he gets. Whereas, if you had put him in a hot pot, if it didn't like burn his legs and have it stick, to the pot, if he was able to get out, he would have, he would have gotten out. Sometimes, in life, the quality of things, they begin to deteriorate, and, we adapt instead of, maintaining our standard. We adapt instead of maintaining our standard and objectivity to understand that things are declining and we need to do something. Instead of accepting it, rationalizing. Instead of rationalizing these small declines, it's to hold your chest high and know who you are, know what you're about and what you're not about, know why you started doing this thing, and be willing to fight for these things, right? Because every great human change, it came from a fighter. A fighter, implemented these things, who refused to accept the current norms. For the children of this world are in their generation wiser than the children of light. I've touched on this, many times unprovoked, other scriptures, leading me to here, but hardly ever, discussing this because it was what was quoted, from scripture. So we know that, children of this world are in their generation wiser. Why are the children of the world wiser? What I say, and I always say the same thing, is because of the restrictions that are implemented on the children of God through accusations. No, we know the devil, he's an accuser of the brethren. You see, when you're in the world, we understand that there's no limitations, implied or imposed on anyone, because you're not expected to abide by any sort of, code. But then, when you become a child of God, then, it comes with such a huge list of, oh, you can't do this, you can't do that, this is not allowed, that is not allowed. And before you know it, you have so many, restrictive weights on you that you're confined to a small area. I use the example of the elephant that's tied to a small pole when he was little. Then when he grew big, he learned not to move from it. So this big, strong elephant is being held in position by a small, stake in the ground, which he could move that thing with, anytime he wanted. I say that these come in the forms of accusation, because then you'll hear people say that, oh, you're not allowed to do that. Oh, you're not allowed to, being wise. They say, oh, you're not allowed to do that. God wouldn't want you thinking like that. Being, cunning and skilled. It's almost like these things are not expected. It's like you're supposed to just be in limbo, right? I say that the children of this world, it's not that they're wiser than the children of light. I would say it's that the children of light, they are pushed down from where they should be. Children of this world, they're fine, they are where they are supposed to be. It's the children of the light. Yeah, they have been reduced. They have been censored. The children of the light, they have been forced to occupy, less space. They have been displaced. The children of the light have been displaced from where they should be. And it comes in the form of accusations. If a person is a believer and they're rich, you look at them, how is it that you're a Christian and you have so much money? Is a typical question they could ask you, right? And then, you could feel the weight of judgment on you. So, this steward, he used, what his Lord is calling. I'm still, in protest. What his Lord is calling, wise methods to extract, payment for these things, giving discounts, lowering the price, even though I already said, I'm pretty sure we had a thorough debate, challenging each other, establishing these prices. You're telling me you're gonna undercut me, and that's what you're doing. You're undercutting me and shorting me. I did not short you. I honored my part of the deal. I fulfilled my part of the deal. Now you're gonna give me excuses, ethics in relationships, right? Honor and integrity. These things, they mean nothing, anymore, right? But some people, they walk around and I want to call them like they're a little weasel. And you ask them, how did they get like this? It's because of things like this, right? Cutting corners, when the opportunity presented itself, shorten people when the opportunity presented itself, not sticking to your guns and being solid, right? Not because nobody's watching means that you get to fall asleep. Your conscience is watching. Your inner strength is watching. Your purpose is watching. Your pride, your inner pride is watching. So the children of this world are in their generation wiser than the children of light. So the next verse says, therefore I say unto you, make unto yourselves friends of the unrighteous mammon, that when you fail, they may receive you into everlasting habitations. So, this is the only time I've ever seen Jesus look at the glass half empty. This is a half empty kind of statement, I would say, from him, even from him, right? Therefore make unto yourselves friends of the unrighteous mammon, that when you fail, right, we know that we can do all things through Christ, right? We know that if we have faith as small as a mustard seed, all things are possible to them that believe. He did just tell them, they asked him a question. Are there few that be saved? He said, strive to enter in at the straight gate, for many I say unto you will seek to enter therein, shall not be able. This goes in along with that, with those that are not able. But, we don't usually see him giving advice to those that don't make it. He will focus on the ones that do, because there's nothing that can be done for the ones that don't. We know that it's weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth. Depart from me, you didn't make it. We've never really seen him take a turn, to give advice to the fallen like this. Because this is a fallen one, right? So make unto yourselves friends of the unrighteous mammon. So we know that he said, man can't serve two masters. He will love the one or hate the other, or he will love the other and hate the one. Man cannot serve but God and mammon. So in that, scripture, it was understood that mammon was not a good thing to serve. So now he's giving a distinction, unrighteous mammon. So then you can ask the question, is there a righteous mammon? I looked up the definition of mammon, and it was given as, ungodly, kind of, riches, or even idolizing idol, mammon just by itself, without the adjusting, title of being righteous or unrighteous. So he's telling, have a backup plan. Like I said, this is the first time you ever really hear him speaking glass half empty. Have a backup plan in case you fail, with the world. We know that there's a scripture that says, fellowship the light have with darkness. He that is a friend of the world is the enemy of God, he said. But then, right now, have a backup plan. That when you fail, right, literally he said, when you fail, they might receive you into everlasting habitations. So, you can go and be with those that failed. Like I said, this is the first time you really see him giving advice to those that failed. Because, he's usually very, matter of fact, about, this separation, showing even how the angels shall gather, the chaff to be burnt, but he shall gather the wheat into his barn, into his storehouse, so that make to yourselves friends of the unrighteous mammon, so that when you fail, they might receive you to everlasting habitations. So this is what this steward is doing. He's making unrighteous mammon, how he's handling his Lord's money, so that they will receive him. But I common sense question. I just watched you give me a 50% discount. You think I'm bringing you inside of my business? Sometimes, we do things with people, not realizing how it lowers our position in their eyes. And, while we're doing something that they benefit from, we think that they're going to honor us because we sold our soul, for their approval or for their, alliance, not realizing the character flaw it reveals unto them and how they, lower us in their eyes. It has the opposite effect. As the last verse says, for he that is faithful in that which is least is also faithful in that which is much. But he that is unjust in that which is least is also unjust in that which is much. So it shows that a man can only have one, overall heart, theme, heart tone. So this video, I titled it, you can either look at things to increase them or to consume them. And this statement is in agreement with that title. Because if you're either gonna have the heart, and it also shows how definitions can be slightly misleading, because either this faithful in that which is least, also faithful in that which is much. It shows a more overall picture, right, of either being faithful or unjust. When you see the person that's being faithful or unjust, they don't see it like that, right? It's an overall observation where the moving parts, they don't think like that. It's either you have humility and meekness, and you have a heart to watch things grow and to not consume them. It's these small things that when you look at the overall picture, you will see that, wow, this person is faithful and not unjust. But then if you look at the small parts, you don't that's not what you see. And that's how I think a lot of people get mixed up. Is because they start looking for something or being something, and they know what the overall picture is described at. But you see, the small working parts is different. These small working parts, they work together to give you something different that you're observing. So then if you go and take this overall observation and then try to work, it doesn't lead you there. Counterintuitive, is the best word to describe this. So he that is faithful in that which is least, right, is faithful in that which is much. He that is unjust, because you're either only gonna have one frame of mind and point of view. And it's gonna lead to either one of these things. And it also shows that for the faithful especially, these people, they have good morals and integrity. They can't be bought, right? You can't buy these people with money or material things or promises of anything. They're not motivated. This is not how their mind works. They're not motivated by these things. You can't come and use these things as traps to lure them away from who they are. So they stay solid and grounded and firm. So it doesn't matter if it's it's a little bit that's in front of them, or if it's a lot that is in front of them. They're not motivated by these things, and it doesn't affect them. They're too solid who they are, to fall to being, a worm, a little worm. Is the only way I can describe it. All right, so here we are, still at the early parts of the 16th chapter of Luke, where it started out saying, then he said unto the disciples, a certain rich man had a steward. Now the same was accused that he had been wasteful with his Lord's goods. So the Lord called unto him the steward and said, what is this that I hear of thee? Give an account of thy stewardship, for thou mayest no longer be steward. And the steward said within himself, what shall I do? For my Lord doth take it away the stewardship from me. To dig I cannot, and to beg I am ashamed. I am resolved what I should do when I am put out of the stewardship, that they might receive me into their houses. So he called unto him each one of his Lord's debtors. And he said unto the first, how much owest thou unto my Lord? And he said, 100 measures of oil. He said, take thy bill, sit down quickly, and write 50. So he called unto him the second one and said, how much owest thou unto my Lord? He said, 100 measures of wheat. He said, take thy bill, sit down quickly, and write fourscore. So the Lord of this servant commended him for that he had done that which was wise. For the children of this generation are in their light, wiser than the children of light. Therefore I say unto you, make unto yourselves friends of the unrighteous mammon, that when you fail, they might receive you into everlasting habitations. For he that is faithful in that which is least is also faithful in that which is much. But he that is unjust in that which is least is also unjust in that which is much. I am Straw Greenhorn.